Hello, everybody. Welcome to Yestergear, Episode 1. I am Matt Gaines, and with me, joining us, guest number 1 is Mr. Tom Merritt. Say hello.
Guest number 1?
Guest number 1. Ready Player 1, yes.
I feel so honored.
You are Player 1.
Right. Well, you're Player 1.
Right. Well, I'm being nice.
I'm Ready Player 2.
I want to thank you for being on the show. For those of you that don't know, this is an idea that I've had in my head for like almost 10 years. The funny thing is that the tech that was around when I came up with the idea is now like old.
You were waiting to cover the tech that was new when you had the idea.
Pretty much. It's like I could talk about zip drives now. Yes.
It's like Lucas. It's like George Lucas waiting for the tech to catch up with his ideas. You were doing the reverse.
Remember that? So this show is something that I've had in my head for a while. If you haven't read the blog post, we had a storeroom at my last job with a lot of old tech in it, and I'm always interested in it. I don't use it very often, but it's not so much the tech itself sometimes as it is about the stories about it. I don't know how much I don't know how many stories we're going to get out of a Hayes modem, but there are some things. Well, we may be surprised. Maybe there's somebody out there that can actually tell some interesting stories about the Hayes modem. But I wanted to have Tom on because he, like myself, were about the same age and we've grown up with the same things. And so I asked Tom to pick something. And what have you picked for us today, Tom?
Well, I picked two things because I was greedy, and they actually kind of tie together in my story about them.
Yes.
The first is the TI-30 calculator, the electronic slide rule, as they market it.
That's what they called them. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So what's your story about that? I have a similar story, but you go first.
Okay. So with the TI-30, my dad was a food scientist.
Mm-hmm.
So he needed to do a lot of mostly chemistry, but he needed a calculator. So we always had calculators around growing up. We had slide rules too, but very early on, like certainly, I was born in 1970. So by 73 or 4, when I can remember, there were very simple electronic calculators around the house. This one came along in the mid 70s. I think around 75, 76,
I think. Yeah.
76. Yeah. Okay. That would make sense. And it had memory, which none of the other calculators had. And it had all these cool functions. I had no idea what they were, but they made the numbers dance, like sine, cosine, and tangent. And it had these little cards that came in it that would let you do stuff with it. So some of them were like just teaching you how to do basic mathematical functions. One of them was how to calculate your biorhythms.
Yes, I remember the biorhythms were a big thing in the late 70s and early 80s.
Oh, yeah.
They're like selling points for computers. I never really understood that.
So I would find out if my physical or my mental biorhythm was high all the time. And I learned all the things like how to spell things putting numbers upside down.
Did the same.
But I played with the thing so damn much that my dad actually had to buy a second one. And he didn't even tell me about it. Like, this was his, but I would just borrow it all the time.
Yeah.
And so he finally, like, one day I noticed that he had a second one. I'm like, why did you get a second one? Is there something wrong with this one? He's like, no, you just keep using it. It's fine.
Keep the other one. Yeah.
Which I didn't even understand how cool that was at the time of my dad to just recognize. Like, if it were me, I could have very easily seen myself saying, okay, well, we need to set some rules, son, about how you... But my dad was just like, you know what?
Yeah.
That's a really good thing for him to spend his time on. I'm not going to discourage that.
Yeah. I had a similar story. My dad was a physics teacher. And in his classroom, he had a slide rule. I used to go and visit once when my mom would bring me or something like that for lunchtime. And one day he comes home with a TI-57. And the TI-57, by the way, your selling point on the TI-30 were parentheses.
Yes, the parentheses keys right here.
Yes.
Boom, boom.
Yeah.
Which I didn't realize how cool that was because I went from a one that had the 4 operators and the numbers to like all of this stuff. But you're right. Like HPs didn't have the parentheses.
Right. So the TI-57s had come out and he brought one home. And for 1977, bringing home a shiny new calculator was cool. We had the same thing as you do. We had the cheap normal calculators that had no memory and things like that, and they could just do the 4 basic functions. But the TI-57, which I'll probably wind up doing on a whole separate show because I just don't have it with me. But it had two big things. It had the second key, which allowed, so it's sort of the equivalent, the 1977 equivalent of a shift key. So you press second, and then above the key, like the keys would have their functions printed on it, but above them there'd be like the shift functions. The second thing is that it was programmable. And that's how I sort of cut my teeth on learning how to write programs. And they were very rudimentary, and they were only math specific. But it was a way for me to say, well, if you want to figure out what like this long function is, you just put in your number, you press enter, the numbers danced just like on your TI-30, and it spit out your number. And that was it. And it was just a great little machine. So that was
the TI-30 came. I was just reaching back to get this lovely denim case.
We had pleather ones on the TI-57.
Yeah, well, that's because the next year it was the disco era.
Yes, it was.
In 1960, we were still, the TI-30 came out when it was still in the hippie era. So
not many people remember. I was born in '67, so I remember those days very, very well. The price on that was $175 with a $25 rebate. So
for the TI-30?
For the TI-30, so $150 in 1976 was what? Like what is it now? It's like 8 to 1 for inflation.
Let's look. I think you can do that easy on Google. What was $175 in 1976? See what it says. But yeah, I mean, you're talking roughly 100.
Does it say?
No, it gave me a calculator, so I have to enter everything.
Yeah, I don't. But all I know is that houses that were like $180,000 or $200,000 when we were buying this one were about $20,000 in '67. $175
of 1976 money is worth $729.17 today.
So there you go. Yeah.
So this is about the cost of an unlocked phone.
And for back then,
a high end,
for the chips that were made back then, that was a big deal. That is about the kind of technology. But like I said, parentheses were a big deal. So then you could do 8 plus parentheses 5 times 3. I don't know if that thing had if anybody remembers math. There were operation rules. Where you always do like certain ones you do multiplication and division first, and then you do the addition and subtraction and such.
Well, if it had parentheses, it must have.
Yeah,
I can't imagine it didn't.
It had to. So that was nice. Do you still use it?
No,
not
really.
Nobody does.
I don't even have a 9-volt battery in it right now, just because I know that if I put one in, I'd forget to take it out and it'd ruin it when it burst.
Do it for I have the old Mattel. Football game, football, baseball, and basketball.
Yeah,
I use them once in a while, but for the most part, I forget about them.
You mean these?
Yes. Look, you've got those too. Oh, you've got the racing one.
Yeah, I love this one.
That one I don't have.
Yeah, this one's. That was actually probably this one and baseball were my favorites.
Yeah, football. Growing up, football was everybody had it. It was huge.
Well, football too.
Football too, yes.
Was the bomb because you could pass.
Yeah.
So you could only run in the first one.
And Coleco had one. And the selling point on that one was that it was $10 cheaper than Mattel.
Oh yeah.
It's
good. It was that we were talking about this before the show though. There have always been format wars, right? And I was definitely a Mattel handheld game fan. And the Coleco ones I was like, those just aren't.
This is not good enough. There was just something about the Coleco ones were the Mattels were the nice shiny white. I think the Mattels were like a little grayish or something like that. But the Mattel football ones,
kind of off-white, beige-ish.
Yeah, but Mattel really knew how to build something that looked a few years ahead of where it came from.
Yeah, it's a good sleek design. I have to say,
Johnny Ive would be proud.
Maybe young Johnny Ive.
Young Johnny Ive would be proud. The other thing, which will probably take up the bulk of the show today, is the TI-99 4 and 4A. You owned one. I did not. You owned. What?
I did.
Yeah.
So you never had one, but you had one nearby to you. Is that right?
I had one 2 houses down. My friend Anthony, who I'm still we still talk even after all these years, 40 some odd years later. We had our own little format war because he had a TI and I had an Atari 800, and so we would argue about who had the better machine. By the way, if you look at the specs, it turns out that the TI probably was point for point the better machine, and it came out a few years later also.
Well, and it came out 81 with 16K of RAM, and I still actually remember there were advertisements that said none of TI's home computers have less than 16K as a big selling point. That's the minimum. Yeah.
The Atari had 8, and I think the Atari 800 came with 8, and the 400 came with 4. And the 400 was the one with those crappy membrane keys. I don't know how that ever got out. Yeah,
those were horrible.
But I had the original 800, the beige 800.
So the other cool dad story about the TI-99
Yes, tell us about this.
I had saved up my money from my allowance.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say it was an entire year. It might not have been, but I had saved up $100.
Wow.
Right? So it took a lot because I wanted to get an Atari 2600.
Oh, yes.
My friend Jonathan Pennington had one, and all these other people I knew had one, and I was like, God, I want an Atari 2600. So I think it was my birthday or near my birthday. We went to Kmart. We went to the Atari 2600 on the shelf. And I had my, bank full of money, which honestly, I'm like, why didn't my parents cash that in for dollars? Like, were they really going to let me pay with just pouring the money out there? But anyway, I had my bank, and my dad said, hold on, before you pick that up, I'm reaching for it. He's like, let me make you an offer. Oh. And there's a TI-99 4A on the shelf right next to it for $200.
Huh.
And the Atari 2600 was $100. He said, if you want to get the computer, I will give you the extra $100.
Wow. That's a tough deal.
Oh, man. And I was like, you tell me this now? I have the Atari 2600 in my hands.
I can't even Google which one's better.
I'm about to walk out. And I just sit there, and I like to think it took me hours. It probably took me like 5 minutes. But I was like, I really want the Atari 2600. But the TI can do more. It's a computer, right? And so I finally rationalized it to myself that, well, the TI-99 has games. They have Parsec, and they have a version of pole position and stuff. So I guess, I won't be able to swap games with Jonathan Pennington, but at least I'll be able to play games. And so I went for it. I went for the matching funds, and I got the TI-99, and I'm so glad I did because I learned that ANSI version of BASIC that was on the TI, and that started me getting interested in programming and buying computer magazines and all this stuff. And I'm not sure if I would have done that if I'd got the Atari 2600. I might have ended up working for GameSpot instead of CNET.
No, it's entirely possible. I'm just going to go over my story real quick because it's not quite similar, but. My dad had bought us an Atari 2600 for Christmas of '78, I believe, if I remember that correctly. My grandfather had bought me a computer because he bought my sister a piano. And so, as I said before the show, it's like Ferris Bueller. She got the piano, I got the computer. So I started buying, I did the same thing that you did. I started buying the computer magazines. I still have some of them upstairs. Atari Connection magazine, if anybody remembers that. But like I said, my friend Anthony had the TI-99, and what was the selling point of the 99 was the speech synthesis, and people knew what the speech synthesis sounded like already because it was in the Speak and Spell, which was also huge in 1980-81. And you're looking up something. Do you have it?
Well, I have a TI-99.
You have the box with the TI-99 inside.
There is a TI-99 inside. I have the speech synthesizer too, but I don't think it's in the box. I think it's somewhere else in the closet.
Okay. I was doing some research on the TI-99's speech synthesizer, and it was very good, but it also had some quirks. Look at that. You've got he's holding the 99. Look at that. That's amazing.
It's in good shape too.
Yeah, it does look like it's in good shape. The speech synthesizer, as I said, was like Speak and Spell, so it was legible, but audible, I should say, in the way that it didn't garble very much. But if you told it to say in Basic and TI Basic, if you told it to say something with like an exclamation point, it wouldn't know how to parse the exclamation point off the word and start spelling it, which was very strange. But it was still very good, and there are some games that incorporated the speech synthesizer inside it, and I forgot what they were. You mentioned one of them before, but I did look them up.
Parsec was
Parsec, yes.
the one that I had. And the speech synthesizer, what's funny is I just noticed it's on the box.
Mm-hmm.
It shows it connected, but it didn't come with it. You had to buy
okay.
it separately.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what TI did with the 99.4A. The 99.4, as you found out with your research, was not as good of a seller. It was much more expensive, $1,150.
It came with a monitor. Yeah.
Came with a monitor. And what they did with the 4A was they figured out how to reduce what they included with it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, parts had become cheaper over a couple of years, right? And so they sold it for cheaper and then sold you upgrades.
Yeah.
So you'd get it you'd get 16K, and if you wanted 64K, you could buy an expansion. If you wanted advanced basic, you bought a cartridge. If you wanted speech synthesis, you bought a speech synthesizer.
Yeah. It seems to me, I don't know. I couldn't really tell, and I didn't find this. Did the TI-99 come with an assembler editor built into the box? Because
no, you had to buy a cartridge.
You did? All right.
Yeah.
Because I thought I saw somebody, there was TI Basic. When you start up the machine, it would say, what do you want to do? You want to start up TI Basic, or do you want to start up the game that's inserted? I could have sworn that there was a third one or maybe it was just some other way that they did it, but there was an option that I saw for the assembler editor and then a game underneath that.
Yeah,
but,
I think. Well, there were a couple of things you could do. They had this whole expansion interface. I can't remember what they called it, which was really just a rack, and then the rack you could buy things to put in there, and maybe if you had the assembler editor in the rack, possible, and that was connected, then it would give you that extra option.
The expansion on the TI-99 series was very funky, where you had the machine and the expansions only came off the right side of the device. And so you can buy all these expansions and your machine would wind up physically growing to the right. And Tom is showing us the expansion port right now. So what TI did was they put out a box that allowed you to connect to the expansion port, but that box would hold, 8 of them, I believe. And
I think it was about 8.
There's the expansion port, and that was that was our expansion ports back in the 80s. Were cards.
You just string it along the side.
Yeah, these big ugly cards. It had a thermal printer that you could buy separate. It had the modem that you could buy separate. Just the same things as I had with the Atari. But I remember my friend Anthony calls me up. He says, "I got something I want to show you." I go over his house, and he says, "Listen to this," and his TI-99 starts talking, and that was in 1983 or 84, whenever this was and that happened. That was a huge thing. That it just listen to decent speech synthesis in that time.
Well, and it was computery.
It was,
but it wasn't like a robot.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of like if I remember it right, it was like incoming spaceships.
Yeah.
So like not all the tones were there, but it wasn't robotic. Like it had inflection.
Yeah, it did. And there was actually something I was looking up in my research that said that can even program in sarcasm.
Yeah, so, well, it had enough inflection. I could see that for sure.
Yeah.
Check out this antenna modulator.
That's great.
This thing is gargantuan.
That's bigger than I don't know why it has to be so big. The Atari ones.
I don't know why it was so big. I mean, I guess they were trying to modulate against interference from outside, but and then it came with these extra things you could put up along the top keys. If you had programmable function keys, you could change them.
What did you wind up doing with it? Like, how did this thing shape where you are today?
Well, I started programming on it. which I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't have done if I'd gotten a game console, if I gotten the Atari 2600. So I started writing BASIC. I started buying Compute magazine and Kids Basic magazine. I even started buying PC Computing magazine, even though it didn't come with any programs I could enter. So I wasn't sure if it was as good of a buy or not. But I would enter these basic programs and then I would start tweaking them. I would start changing them up. I remember the one I was most proud of was a slot machine game that I made some improvements to. And I don't even remember what the improvements were anymore. But my dad did buy the cassette adapter so that I could save the games to cassette. And I would create, my own puzzle games and basic games. And it really did stoke my interest in technology, which was already there, but I spent hours on this thing in my room when probably I would have been just watching TV or playing a game or something like that. Not necessarily going outside and playing a game either, right? Playing those Mattel games. But I was programming all the time, and it got to the point where I saved up money to buy a broken case discount color television at JCPenney so that I could have the proper 13-inch monitor, because what I had was my dad's old black and white TV, so the prompt for the cursor was off the screen. And so when I finally got like the proper aspect ratio and I could actually see the prompt, I was so excited. And things were in color now too. And then I got to the point where I'm like, 16K isn't enough. And so I wanted to buy the expander. I wanted to buy all this stuff. And my dad's like, that's too expensive. So I ended up, I think in 84, asking and getting, I was so lucky. I didn't realize how lucky I was getting a Commodore 64.
Oh yeah.
And then started getting into like what was in fact real programming. TI Basic was limited. And then with Commodore, you could peek and poke and you could have an actual floppy drive and address that. So the TI-99 launched me into my interest of all of that stuff.
I started, as far as real computers go, the first computer I ever touched was like a Commodore VIC-20, which was in a Haynes Anchor store at the Woodbridge Mall. All right, and I just knew that it was there, so I had this interest in computers, and I would bring my code there, and I would actually try it on the machine in the store. I'm not going to go into this whole story. This is actually more for the Atari one, which I'll do at some point. But I'll just say that I started working on TRS-80 Model 3s in high school. And that's where I started learning, like you said, to do real programming. Not just like, here, let's draw a line and make it move or something, but actually learning what it's like to write code a little more efficiently and such.
Well, I remember getting frustrated with TI Basic because I could see what I wanted to do with my program, and I could tell that Basic should let me do it, but TI Basic didn't have the capabilities. And some of it was reading these magazines and saying, well, if you have Advanced Basic or if you have a Commodore 64, you write it this way. And I'm like, that's so many fewer lines of code. Yeah. Like, I don't have to go to so much trouble to make stuff happen. And I can add sprites and do all this kind of stuff. So, its limitations sort of pushed me into stuff that I wouldn't have wanted or known I wanted otherwise. Yeah. And TRS-80s were probably the first computers that I ever touched because we had a Radio Shack in my town.
Yes.
And I would just go and I would play on the TRS-80 that they had set up at the Radio Shack. I would do that all the time.
Do you remember?
I also learned to program on an Apple II.
Okay.
At a summer week-long computer camp thing.
We had a TRS-80s in school, like I said, but we also had, I graduated from high school in 85. We had a Macintosh, and you had to have real damn special permission to touch that Macintosh. And I remember I got permission. I still have it. It was printed on what was it, the Apple Writer. I did a representation of our school, but I added, if you remember from Return of the Jedi, the indoor had the what was it, the dish, and then the Death Star in the sky and everything. So I added that.
Oh, right, the big satellite dish.
Yeah, the big satellite dish. So I still have that. Good, and I have printouts of like practically every program I ever wrote. I'll mention more about this, but I wound up writing a game for the Radio Shack computer. I was writing it in my spare time at lunch, and I converted it. It was my first port. I did a port to the Atari 800, and I sent it into the Star Wars fan club and wound up winning 10th place in their creativity contest.
Well done.
So
nice.
yeah. So that was good. But this is one of the things that I'd like to get to with this show is hearing people's stories and how this old technology, even though it is old, you can still use it today. That's the last thing that I wanted to talk about real quick is you can still use these today. The TI 99s had a composite output, and you use standard RCA audio jacks for, or maybe it was mono. I don't remember. But you can still use those today, but are they very practical?
Yeah, I don't know what you would use it for other than nostalgia.
Nostalgia, that's just it.
I'm looking at the antenna modulator, and it's a proprietary pin.
Oh, is it?
On the back for this one. There might have been models with the RCA out though.
Okay, yeah, because I know the Atari 2600 and 800, and I believe the Nintendo used standard RCA for their RF out.
Yeah, a lot of them did.
Yeah.
And it's just a composite port out, which is funny because that was like strange. We're all used to either having, that 30 ohm coax cable if we were fancy and had cable, or you just had the two screws from the antenna leads.
Yeah. And then also another thing that we were talking about before we started recording was the price wars, which I don't think a lot of people remember. You don't get price wars today. When Google or Apple or Samsung puts out a device, that's it. Maybe I'll get some sales or something, but people don't remember what the price wars were like back then. And the TI-99
it's more regimented now, isn't it? I hadn't even thought about that. Like when an iPhone comes out, it's going to be $199 subsidized, and then a year from now it'll be $99 subsidized, and then a year, it's always the same.
Or then it'll be free. But back then it was different. The TI-99 came out, and they were up against the Commodore VIC-20. And the Atari 800 had come out in '79. The TI-99 comes out in 1981. Commodore drops their price. TI gets nervous. They start to drop their price. It originally came out, the 4A came out for $525, and you said that by the time you got it, it was $200.
Yeah. And that's probably, like I said, it's probably the next summer. So it'd been out a year, and they dropped it down to $200.
Yeah. I was reading the Wikipedia page, and it was written that TI was probably losing money on it at the end.
Yeah, they just wanted to get rid of them. I remember after, I was telling you, I saw a JCPenney catalog page online earlier today that said you could get the TI-99 4A for $99, regular $150, but $50 rebate. And that was a white model, not the chrome model that I had. So they kept making it, but they changed the look of it to be more Atari-like because they were having a hard time competing with the Atari brand name.
They did. TI, let's put this in perspective. TI back then, they were huge.
Oh, yeah.
They made practically everything.
Yeah, if you had a calculator, it was TI. Unless you were like someone in an industry that needed an HP, right? HP was the higher end. TI was the mass producer.
Yeah. TI was, I would say, the equivalent of maybe Apple or Microsoft today.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they just wound up, I guess other people innovated better than they could. The price.
Well, and that's the interesting thing. When you think about those early days, you have Microsoft innovating as a startup in operating system. You have Apple innovating as a startup in hardware. And then you have the incumbents like IBM and TI pivoting from what they know how to do already and trying to get into the personal computer market. And I guess, you shouldn't discount Commodore.
No, not at all. Either. And just one thing about what happened with the TI is that for some reason TI was very what's the word that I want to use? They're very tough on giving people information about the device, and so it was very difficult for third-party developers to build anything for it. Whereas Apple and everybody, Apple, Atari, Commodore, they're like, here you go, here are hundreds of third-party books. Here are the peek and poke. Here's a list of all the registers that you can screw around with. And TI was like, no, we don't want to do that. And how many times have you and I seen this over the years? Some great company comes out, but they hold everything close to themselves. And this happens not even so much with devices, but websites. They don't put out an API. Somebody else does, and they're the ones that win because people can develop for them.
Well, it's funny to think of Apple as the open one in the early days. They were the most open in those early days, and now they're almost the opposite.
Well, as far as API goes, just don't. If you remember the inside
API,
Macintosh
I'm not talking
books,
about their API. I'm talking about the hardware, but yeah.
I know what you mean, yeah. You're right. You're absolutely right. I said it's very different today, but I think that one thing is what caused the demise of the TI. I just have a short list about what the TI was up against at the time. There's a TRS-80 Model 3, Atari 800, Commodore 64 a little later, the VIC-20, the Timex Sinclair, which was like the cheapo thing. Do you have one? Wow. I always wanted to get one of those.
Now, the hilarious story behind this is that my dad bought it at the coast-to-coast hardware store in our town. Like all these others, we had to travel 30 miles away to a Kmart or a Target or something. This happened to be at the coast-to-coast. It was like an impulse buy for him one day. He's just like, yeah, let's get that. And this was going to be his.
Yeah.
The thing was, he never bought a tape drive for it.
Oh, so you couldn't really save anything.
He bought a thermal printer for it, which was useless because you could only print what you were typing right then. But
that's funny. Also, the Atari, the IBM PC and the Apple II. And history, if you know your history, you'll know what happened to all those companies. I was a die-hard Atari guy, and that's how I got into the Macintosh. I went from the 2600 to the 800 to the 800 XL to the ST to the Mac.
Oh, I love comparing lineages like that. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And so you went from the TI-99. Where did you go from after that?
I went from the TI-99 to the Commodore 64 to the IBM PS2 3286.
Yes.
With Windows 286.
Yes, I remember that.
And then I think from there I got a Packard Bell 486DX.
Mm-hmm.
Then an HP Pavilion. An Acer with a 100 megahertz processor in it. It's very exciting to get a Pentium. I didn't have that before.
With a turbo switch.
And then I went from the Acer to the HP Pavilion with a 200 megahertz processor. HP to Compaq with an AMD, then the Compaq to a Dell, and then it just explodes because I've got laptops and things.
It's interesting how like my lineage went from Atari to Mac because of the Atari ST. That to me was like the impetus for everything that I've ever done as far as Macintosh goes was that Atari ST. And my loyalty back then, even as a teenager, was Atari and nothing else.
Well, I used Macs at work.
Uh-huh.
So I guess it's the equivalent of work, but like when I went to that lab as a junior hire, I learned on an Apple II. And when I worked in a radio station in college, we used Macs at the radio station. And so I was always bilingual, right? Because I had Windows at home, but I would use Macs elsewhere all the time. And I ended up switching to OS X on a laptop while I was working at CNET because I was frustrated that I couldn't reliably and certainly not legally, or at least without violating the terms, put OS X on my ThinkPad. And I loved ThinkPads. But every time I would try to do something and show it, I'd run into trouble with people saying, well, we can't really encourage people to put OS X on Windows. Yeah. So I was like, fine, I'm going to run Windows in Boot Camp on a Mac so that I can easily show all of these things you can do. And then eventually I sort of felt like OS X was a Fisher-Price looking operating system for the longest time. I still kind of do. But I eventually just started using OS X more often than Windows, even on the MacBook Pro.
30 years of a lineage. I never even thought of that. I'd like to see as this show goes along. I like to hear what people's lineages are.
Yeah,
what they started with.
Really interesting.
Because I I set this show up to just hear how it helped people with their careers and their interests and hobbies and things like that. But to hear the lineages, I like that.
Well, and it's insightful because I wonder if you'll find that there's a common path of, the Atari people end up more often with Apple, and maybe the Commodore people end up more often with Windows. I don't know.
In high school, there was me, Pete, and Rich. We were the Atari people. I can't remember the names of the Commodore people, but there were Commodore people who we would fight all the time. Not like fist fights or anything, but we would do the same jabs. Like, well, do you have Marble Madness on your Atari? Ah, you don't. But we have it on the C64.
My friend Donald Hertz down on the corner from down the street I lived had a Commodore 64, and he was like connected. I don't even know who he knew, but as far as like getting any kind of game, I just had to bring my 1541 over to his house.
Yeah,
we were, I could get pretty much anything I wanted.
We had BBSs, and we all traded that way. And there was my friend Mike down the road. His mom worked at an Atari cartridge. I don't know the places that actually make them.
Oh wow!
And so he would come over with these those plastic like the needle and thread cases. He would come over with those with like 4 or 5 chips and then an empty cart, and he would slide it into my machine, put the chip in, lock it, and then we were playing like was it Demon Attack? What company made that? Was it a Magic or something like that? We would play that and a whole bunch of other games that they were making at this plant. So, yeah, interesting.
Very cool.
All right, I want to thank you for being on the show. This is far better than I thought it was going to be. I've had this in my head for so many years, and now to actually
it's such a good idea for a show. I had so much fun talking over all this stuff.
Yeah, really you're always welcome to come back if there's something else that you want to bring up or something like that. Feel free.
See what else I've got sitting around.
See what you got. I don't know how much we can get out of a Timex Sinclair, though. Those are like little mini. I don't know if you think there's a show's worth of.
I don't know if there's a show in that, but I might have some other stuff. Let me think about it.
Yeah. I have just to let people know what's coming up. I've been talking to Patrick. If everybody knows Patrick Beja, he and I have been talking back and forth about doing a show on the Atari 2600.
Oh, great!
And so I think that's going to be next, I believe. And then I've been talking to Scott Johnson, and he wants to do something about reel-to-reel tape decks, which also he and I have in common. I still have not all of them. I can't find all of them, but I have probably the most important one, which is the first recording I've ever done as a 2-year-old on reel-to-reel tape decks, and that's how I started doing this. What I'm doing now is because of that reel-to-reel tape deck. That's
amazing. You know what? I need to get a hold of a reel-to-reel machine because I have reel-to-reel air checks from when I worked in radio that I've got sitting around, and I would love to digitize those.
Yeah, I have to call my uncle. He was a big audio nut years ago, and he actually gave his collection to the Library of Congress and got this will give you an idea of how much he had. He got a $90,000 tax break.
Wow.
He had a lot of damn vinyl. A lot.
That's crazy.
And so there's that. But I think he may still have his reel-to-reel tape deck, so I'm going to have to digitize my stuff also. Okay. Tom, how does everybody get a hold of you?
You can follow me on Twitter. If you find Tom Merritt on Twitter, I do run that account, and it'll tell you how to find my stupidly named other account, which is AceDetect, ACEDTECT. Or you can find me every day, Monday through Friday, talking about the tech news at dailytechnewsshow.com.
And also, Tom has a Patreon for that. I am a patron of your show.
Thanks, boss.
It's essentially, I kind of am, aren't I?
Yeah.
I think I like to think of myself as a shareholder instead. But
yeah, I like that too.
The Daily Tech News Show is great. And
thank you. I'm glad you like it. I love doing it.
It's a show that needs to be done, and you're doing it. If you want to find me, I am at StarMike on Twitter. The show, it's yestergear.tv. Because the person who owned .com told me that he was going to sell it to me and then didn't. Thank you very much. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Yestergear, Yestergear on Twitter, and the shows will be on YouTube on Yestergear TV. So that's going to do it for episode 1. Tom, thank you again. This is just better than I imagined.
Thanks, man. No, this is really fun. Thanks for having me on.
All right, thanks. Bye.